The cowboy who rescued the Apache prisoner, and now she's all he has. The blood on his hands wasn't his own, but it might as well have been. Marcus Blackwood stared down at the lifeless body of Sheriff Coleman, the man who had raised him, taught him to shoot, and shown him what it meant to be lawful in a lawless land. Now that same man lay dead in the dust of Tombstone's main street, and the woman responsible sat chained in the jail cell behind him. At least, that's what everyone believed. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and death through the barred window as Marcus turned to face her. Ayanna sat with her back against the stone wall, dark eyes fixed on something beyond the horizon that only she could see. Her Apache heritage was unmistakable in the sharp lines of her face and the proud set of her shoulders, even bound as she was. 20 years old, they'd told him. 20 years and already condemned to hang at sunrise. Marcus had worn a badge for 15 years, since he was 23 and full of righteous fury about bringing order to the chaos of the Arizona Territory. Coleman had pinned that star to his chest with steady hands and steady words about justice and duty. Now at 38, Marcus understood that justice and truth weren't always the same thing. The townspeople gathered outside like vultures, their voices rising and falling in waves of anger and bloodlust. They wanted to see her swing. They needed someone to blame for Coleman's death, for the recent Apache raids, for every fear that kept them awake at night in this unforgiving land. Ayanna made a perfect scapegoat. But Marcus had seen the real killer's face in Coleman's dying moments. The sheriff's final word hadn't been a name, it had been a warning. And that warning had nothing to do with the young Apache woman now sitting in his jail. The afternoon sun blazed through the windows of the sheriff's office, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Marcus paced between his desk and the cell, the weight of his Colt .45 heavy on his hip. Every step echoed in the silence broken only by the distant sounds of hammering as the townsmen built gallows in the square. He stopped pacing and studied her face. Ayanna's expression remained unchanged, but he caught something in her eyes, not fear, but resignation. She expected to die. More than that, she seemed almost ready for it. This wasn't right. None of it was right. Marcus had investigated enough crimes to know when pieces didn't fit. The bullet that killed Coleman came from a rifle, not the old revolver found near where they'd captured Ayanna. The angle was wrong for someone on horseback, and the powder burns on Coleman's coat suggested the shooter had been on foot, much closer than the Apache hunting grounds where they'd found her. But the town wanted blood, and Mayor Hutchinson had made it clear that Marcus's job depended on giving them what they wanted. A quick trial, a quicker execution, and Tombstone could get back to the business of pretending it was civilized. The sound of approaching horses broke his concentration. Through the window, Marcus saw Mayor Hutchinson riding up with 3 of his men, Frank Morrison, Dutch Stevens, and the newcomer, Jake Carver. All 4 wore the satisfied expressions of men who believed justice was about to be served. The office door swung open with enough force to rattle the windows. Hutchinson entered first, his considerable bulk filling the doorway. Behind him came Morrison and Stevens, both men Marcus had known since his early days wearing the badge. They'd been Coleman's friends, or so they'd claimed. Carver lingered near the door, his pale eyes scanning the room like a predator marking territory. Hutchinson's voice boomed through the small space. "Marcus, son, how's our prisoner doing?" "Still planning to make this difficult?" Marcus kept his expression neutral. "She hasn't said a word since we brought her in. Smart girl. Knows there's nothing to say." Hutchinson approached the cell, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "Tomorrow can't come soon enough for this town. People need to see that killing a lawman has consequences." From the cell, Ayanna spoke for the first time since her capture. Her English was clear, touched with only the slightest accent. "Your lawman was a good man. I did not kill him." Morrison spat into the corner. "Sure you didn't, savage. Just happened to be riding away from town with blood on your hands." "That blood was from a wounded deer. I was hunting to feed my family." Stevens laughed. but there was no humor in it. Your family? You mean those murderers hiding in the mountains? The ones who've been raiding our settlements? Ayanna's jaw tightened. I have no part in those raids. I live apart from the war bands. Hutchinson waved a dismissive hand. Girl, you can tell that story to your ancestors tomorrow morning. Marcus, I want extra men on guard tonight. Some of the more excitable citizens might try to save us the trouble of a hanging. Marcus nodded, but his mind was racing. Every instinct told him Ayanna was telling the truth. Coleman had been investigating something in the weeks before his death riding out alone, asking questions about land deals and water rights. The sheriff had been nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder. After the men left, Marcus found himself alone with his prisoner again. The sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, painting the jail cell in shades of gold and amber. Ayanna sat in the same position, but her eyes now followed his movements. He pulled a chair close to the bars. Tell me what really happened yesterday. For a long moment, she studied his face. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. Why do you ask? You have already decided I am guilty. Maybe I want to hear your side. Men like you do not care about my side. Marcus leaned forward. I'm not like other men. Something flickered in her dark eyes, surprise, perhaps, or the faintest hint of hope. I was hunting in the hills above Cedar Creek. My horse threw a shoe, so I was walking him back to the Apache camp. I heard gunshots from the direction of your town, but that is not unusual. When I reached the main road, I found your sheriff lying in the dust. He was still alive. Marcus felt his heart skip. He was alive? What did he say? He was trying to speak, but blood filled his mouth. I tried to help him, to stop the bleeding. That is when your townspeople found me. Ayanna's voice dropped. They saw an Apache woman covered in blood, standing over their sheriff. They saw what they wanted to see. The pieces clicked into place in Marcus's mind. Coleman had been investigating something that got him killed. The real murderer had left him to die on that road, but Ayanna had found him first. Her compassion had sealed her fate. As the evening shadows lengthened, Marcus made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He couldn't let an innocent woman hang for another man's crime. But saving her would make him an outlaw, cost him everything he'd built in 15 years of wearing a badge. The town of Tombstone settled into an uneasy quiet as night fell. Most citizens had gone home to their families, content in the knowledge that justice would be served at dawn. But Marcus remained in the jail, cleaning his weapons and trying to ignore the weight of what he was about to do. Around midnight, he approached Ayanna's cell with the keys in his hand. She looked up, alert despite the late hour. I believe you, he said simply, and I won't let you hang for something you didn't do. Ayanna rose slowly, her chains rattling. If you free me, you will become an outlaw like me. Maybe that's what this territory needs, a few more outlaws and a few less lawmen who follow orders without asking questions. Marcus unlocked the cell door and stepped inside to remove her shackles. As the iron cuffs fell away, Ayanna rubbed her wrists where they'd left red marks on her copper skin. There's a horse in the stable behind the jail. Take it and ride north toward the mountains. Don't stop until you reach Apache land. Ayanna shook her head. I cannot take your horse. It's not mine. It belonged to Coleman. He'd wanted to carry someone toward freedom rather than death. She moved toward the cell door but stopped beside him. In the dim light from the oil lamp, Marcus could see the intelligence in her eyes, the strength that had carried her through captivity without breaking. Why are you doing this? She asked. Marcus had asked himself the same question 100 times in the past hour. Because someone killed a good man and tried to blame you for it. Because this town would rather hang an innocent woman than admit they don't know who the real killer is. Because it's the right thing to do. They moved through the jail like shadows, Marcus leading the way with practiced silence. He'd walked these halls for years as a keeper of the peace. Now he walked them as a breaker of chains. The back door opened onto an alley that ran behind Main Street. Coleman's horse, a steady bay gelding named Thunder, waited in the small stable. Marcus had already saddled him and loaded the saddlebags with supplies, jerked beef, hardtack, water, and ammunition. As Ayanna mounted the horse, Marcus felt the finality of his choice settle over him like a shroud. By morning, he would be a wanted man. Hutchinson would brand him a traitor, and every lawman in the territory would be hunting him. "Where will you go?" Ayanna asked from the saddle. "I don't know yet. Somewhere far from here." She leaned down and extended her hand. "Come with me." Marcus stared at her outstretched palm. It was small and calloused from hard work, but steady as stone. In that moment, he realized he had nothing left in Tombstone, except a badge that had lost all meaning and the memory of a dead mentor who'd been betrayed by the very system he'd served. He took her hand and swung up behind her onto Thunder's back. They rode out of Tombstone in silence, keeping to the shadows until they reached the desert beyond the town limits. Only then did Marcus allow himself to look back at the place that had been his home for 15 years. The buildings looked small and insignificant against the vast expanse of star-filled sky. The desert night was cold, but Ayanna's warmth pressed against his chest as they rode north toward the distant mountains. She guided Thunder with expert hands, choosing paths that would be difficult to follow come morning. Every mile took them further from the life Marcus had known and deeper into a future he couldn't predict. They stopped to rest near dawn at a hidden spring Ayanna knew among the rocks. While Thunder drank, Marcus studied the horizon behind them. No dust clouds yet, but there would be soon enough. "You have given up everything for a stranger," Ayanna said as she refilled their water skins. "Your people will call you a fool." Marcus sat on a flat rock and watched the sunrise paint the desert in shades of copper and gold. "My people were ready to hang you without a trial. Maybe being a fool is better than being like them. You do not know me. I could be everything they said I was. Could be, but you're not." She joined him on the rock, sitting close enough that he could smell the sage in her hair. "How can you be so certain?" Marcus thought about Coleman lying in the dust, about the fear in the sheriff's eyes before he died, about the satisfied expressions on Hutchinson's face and his men. Because guilty people don't try to save the men who are hunting them. And innocent people don't usually run unless someone's trying to kill them. They rode hard for 3 days, staying ahead of the posse Marcus knew would be following. Ayanna led them through country that would have been impossible for him to navigate alone, hidden canyons, ancient Apache trails, springs known only to her people. She moved through the landscape like she was part of it, reading signs in the rock and sky that were invisible to him. On the third night, they made camp in a sheltered valley where a thin stream ran between cottonwood trees. For the first time since leaving Tombstone, they risked a small fire to cook the rabbit Ayanna had caught with snares she'd fashioned from Thunder's hair. As they ate, Marcus found himself studying her face in the firelight. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with softness or delicacy. Her beauty was like the desert itself, harsh and unforgiving but somehow perfect in its honesty. "Tell me about your family," he said. Ayanna stared into the flames. "My father was Apache. My mother was Mexican. Both are dead now. I have a younger brother who rides with Geronimo, but I have not seen him in 2 years. We disagreed about the path our people should take. What path do you believe in? Survival. Not through war, but through adaptation. The old ways are dying, and we must find new ways to live in this changing world. My brother believes we should fight until we are all dead. I believe we should live however we can." Marcus nodded. He'd seen enough violence to understand her perspective. "Is that why you were living alone? I was not alone. There are others like me, Apache who want peace, Mexican families who need protection, even some white settlers who just want to farm their land without fear. We formed a small community in the mountains, far from the war bands and far from your towns. We were trying to build something new." "Were?" Pain flickered across her features. 3 weeks ago, men came and burned our village. They killed my friends, scattered the families. I was away hunting when it happened. When I returned, There was nothing left but ashes and graves I had to dig alone. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. What did these men look like? White men, well armed. They wore no uniforms, but they moved like soldiers. Their leader had pale eyes and a scar across his left cheek. Marcus's blood turned to ice. Jake Carver had pale eyes and a scar across his left cheek. Carver, who'd been so eager to see Ayanna hang. Carver, who'd arrived in Tombstone just a month ago with money to spend and no clear source of income. Did Sheriff Coleman ever visit your village? Ayanna nodded. He came twice. He said he was investigating raids and wanted to know if we had seen anything. We told him about the men who destroyed our home, described their leader. He promised to look into it. The pieces fell into place with terrible clarity. Coleman had been investigating the raids, but he discovered they weren't being carried out by Apache war bands. Someone was using the ongoing conflicts as cover for their own crimes, probably stealing cattle and selling them across the border. When Coleman got too close to the truth, they'd killed him and framed Ayanna to cover their tracks. Marcus told her what he'd realized. As he spoke, he watched her face harden with a mixture of grief and rage that he recognized in his own heart. They killed your sheriff because he was an honest man. They burned my village because we could identify them. And they would have killed me to keep their secret safe. But now we know the truth. Ayanna's dark eyes reflected the firelight like polished obsidian. Knowing the truth and proving it are different things. Your people will not believe the word of an Apache woman and an outlaw. She was right, but Marcus couldn't let it end there. Coleman deserved justice, and the innocent people of Ayanna's village deserve to be remembered. Then we'll have to get proof they can't ignore. They spent the next week planning their return to Tombstone. It was madness, 2 fugitives riding back into the heart of danger, but it was the only way to clear their names and expose the real killers. Ayanna knew the country well enough to get them close to town without being seen, and Marcus knew the people well enough to predict their movements. The plan was simple in concept, but dangerous in execution. They would watch Carver and his men until they made their next move, then gather evidence of their crimes. If they were lucky, they might catch them in the act. If they weren't lucky, they'd probably end up dead or back in chains. As they prepared to leave their hidden valley, Marcus found himself reluctant to return to the world of badges and laws and civilized violence. For a week, he'd lived simply hunting, talking by the fire, sleeping under stars that seemed close enough to touch. Ayanna's presence had filled a loneliness he hadn't even realized he carried. On their last morning in the valley, she approached him as he saddled Thunder. You could still ride away. Go to California or Mexico. Start over where no one knows your name. Marcus tightened the cinch and checked the rifle in its scabbard. Could you? No. Too many people have died for lies. It has to end. Then we understand each other. They rode south toward Tombstone through country that grew more familiar with each mile. The desert gave way to rolling hills dotted with cattle ranches and mining claims. They avoided the main roads, sticking to game trails and dry washes that offered concealment. 2 days out from town, they encountered their first sign of trouble. Fresh tracks showed a large group of riders had passed through recently, heading northeast toward the border. Marcus counted at least a dozen horses, some carrying extra weight that could have been stolen cattle. Ayanna dismounted and studied the tracks more closely. These horses came from Tombstone. See how the front left shoe on this one is worn? That is the blacksmith's work. He does not set shoes properly. Marcus smiled despite the danger. You notice everything. In my world, noticing everything is how you stay alive. They followed the trail at a safe distance, moving carefully through terrain that offered little cover. As the sun reached its peak, they spotted dust clouds on the horizon. Riders moving fast with a herd of cattle. Using Marcus's field glasses, they watched from a concealed position on a low ridge. 12 men drove about 50 head of cattle toward the Mexican border. Even at a distance, Marcus recognized Jake Carver's pale horse and distinctive hat. Frank Morrison and Dutch Stevens rode with him, along with several other men Marcus didn't know. "There's our proof," Marcus said, but Ayanna shook her head. "Moving cattle is not a crime if they belong to you. We need to see them steal the animals or find evidence that these cattle were taken from their rightful owners." She was right again. They needed more than circumstantial evidence to convince anyone in Tombstone. They needed to catch Carver's men in the act, or find something that directly connected them to the murders and raids they'd been committing. They shadowed the cattle drive for 2 days, staying just close enough to keep the dust clouds in sight. The trail led toward a remote canyon near the Mexican border where smugglers and cattle rustlers had operated for decades. If Carver was planning to sell the stolen herd, this was where it would happen. On the 3rd day, their patience was rewarded. From a hidden vantage point high above the canyon floor, they watched Carver's men drive the cattle into a natural corral formed by rock walls. Within an hour, a group of Mexican buyers arrived with pack mules loaded with silver. Marcus adjusted his field glasses and studied the scene below. The cattle all wore the same brand, the Circle M ranch owned by the Morrison family. But Frank Morrison was down there selling them to Mexican smugglers, which meant either he was selling his own cattle for some reason, or the brand had been altered to hide the animal's true ownership. "Look at the brands more carefully," Ayanna suggested. "Something is not right about them." Marcus refocused the glasses on the cattle. At first glance, the Circle M brands looked normal, but closer inspection revealed subtle differences. The circles were slightly larger than they should be, and the lines of the M seemed thicker in some places. "They're running brands," Marcus realized, taking cattle with different marks and altering them to look like Circle M stock. Morrison's letting them use his ranch as a cover. The transaction below proceeded quickly and efficiently. Money changed hands. The cattle were transferred to the Mexican buyers, and within 2 hours the canyon was empty except for dust and hoof prints. Carver's men rode back toward Tombstone while the smugglers drove their new herd south across the border. Marcus and Ayanna had their proof, but getting it to the right people would be another challenge entirely. Mayor Hutchinson was either involved in the scheme or willfully ignorant of it. Either way, he wouldn't listen to accusations against his supporters. "There is someone in your town who might listen," Ayanna said as they made camp that evening in a hidden arroyo. "The newspaper man Turner. He came to our village once, asking questions about the raids. He seemed honest." Marcus had forgotten about Samuel Turner, the editor of Tombstone's weekly newspaper. Turner had arrived from back east with idealistic notions about frontier journalism and a printing press he'd hauled across half the continent. He'd made himself unpopular with the town's power brokers by asking uncomfortable questions and printing stories they'd rather keep buried. "Turner might listen, but he's just one man with the newspaper. We need someone with authority." "What about the territorial marshal? Does he not have authority over local sheriffs?" Marcus nodded slowly. Marshal James Parker was an honest man, but he was also practical. He wouldn't act on their word alone. He'd need evidence that would stand up in a territorial court. But if they could get Turner to print their story, it might force Parker's hand. They spent another day gathering additional evidence. Following the tracks back toward Tombstone, they discovered a hidden camp where Carver's men had been staying between raids. The site contained stolen goods from a dozen different sources, silver from mining camps, leather goods from ranches, even personal items that had obviously been taken from abandoned homesteads. Among the scattered possessions, Ayanna found something that made her draw a sharp breath. She held up a small wooden doll, crudely carved but painted with care. "This belonged to Maria Santos, a little girl in our village. She was holding it when they killed her." Marcus felt rage building in his chest like a prairie fire. These men hadn't just been stealing cattle. They'd been murdering innocent families and blaming it on Apache raids. How many people had died to protect their criminal enterprise? They gathered what evidence they could carry and prepared for the most dangerous part of their mission, returning to Tombstone to expose the truth. As they rode toward town in the pre-dawn darkness, Marcus realized that everything in his life had led to this moment. 15 years of wearing a badge, of believing in law and order, had prepared him to become an outlaw in service of justice. Beside him, Ayanna rode with the quiet confidence of someone who had already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. She'd found her purpose in seeking justice for her murdered friends, just as he'd found his in honoring Coleman's memory. The sun was rising behind them as the buildings of Tombstone came into view. Somewhere in that collection of adobe and wood structures, killers walked free while the town prepared to celebrate the hanging of an innocent woman who'd already escaped their noose. But Marcus and Ayanna were no longer running. They were coming home to finish what others had started and to ensure that the truth, however inconvenient, would finally see the light of day. The final confrontation was about to begin, and neither of them intended to walk away until justice was served one way or another.